Okay, so what do I mean by Easter eggs? Well, when you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the November 2025 NTSB preliminary report issued on the crash of UPS Flight 2976, you will see something rather unusual, not only for an NTSB final crash report, but especially for a preliminary report. Now, I'm not saying it never happened before. It may have, but I went back and looked at a few reports and I didn't see any real similar reference to similar crashes in preliminary reports, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. So if you saw it and you know of this similar incident, let me know down below. But the section I'm referring to is marked Similar Incidents, where the NTSB noted that the almost identical crash happened in the past on basically the same airframe and predecessor to the MD-11, a DC-10, Flight 191 in Chicago in 1979, a crash that remains the single deadliest aviation crash in U.S. history to this day. And indeed, these two crashes are almost mirror images of one another. Both planes lost their number one engines on takeoff at the same mounting point in the aft lug of the engine pylon mount. However, after a thorough investigation in Flight 191, it was determined that American Flight 191's damage was caused by human error, specifically improper removal of the engine, specifically by using a forklift. And in the case of the UPS crash, the NTSB is blaming the cause on metal fatigue, not human error. And I stress, not at this point at least. However, that begs the question. If the NTSB is already considering two different causes for two separate crashes 50 years apart, and this is purely speculation on my part, but maybe since the NTSB has just begun to investigate this most recent UPS crash, could they be hinting that they may not actually believe that metal failure was the only and sole cause of the crash? Because if you look at this section of the report, these paragraphs kind of jump out. Well, at least to me anyway. And if you already know this, bear with me just a second because I need to set up the bigger picture here that I'm trying to paint, so to speak. Because referring to any prior maintenance on the UPS MD-11, they wrote that a review of the inspection tasks for the left pylon aft mount found that both a general visual inspection and a detailed visual inspection of the left pylon aft mount required by UPS's maintenance program at a 72-month interval was last accomplished 4 years ago on October 28, 2021. And a 24-month, 4,800-hour lubrication task of the pylon thrust links and pylon spherical bearings was last accomplished on 18 October 2025. But the report adds that a special detailed inspection of the left pylon aft mount lugs would have been due at 29,200 cycles, and of the left wing clevis support would have been due at 28,000 cycles. The UPS airplane's records showed these two SDI tasks had not been accomplished because the airplane had only, and I use that term only tongue-in-cheek, 21,043 cycles. This means that the UPS MD-11 was okay to fly for 8,150 more cycles, takeoffs and landings, before those checks would have been required. Yeah, so let that sink in for a minute. Okay, so here's my point, and it's a point that I've actually seen other aviation channels discuss, and I know you watch them as well. So then why did the NTSB bring up the 1979 crash in this 2025 report if they're already leaning toward mechanical or metal fatigue, not human error? Well, a good reason might be that back in 1979, when the NTSB was considering the cause of the American 191 crash, during the investigation, an examination of the pylon attachment points revealed some damage done to the wing's pylon mounting bracket that matched the bent shape of the pylon's rear attachment fitting. This meant that the pylon attachment fitting had struck the mounting bracket at some point. So in 1979, it wasn't hard for the NTSB to determine that the damage to the left wing engine pylon most likely had occurred during an earlier engine change at the American Airlines Aircraft Maintenance Facility in Tulsa, Oklahoma, sometime between March 29 and 30 in 1979. But as you may know, that initial or preliminary assumption was only half true. But the rest of the story was something the NTSB never saw coming. However, on those dates, the aircraft had undergone routine service during which the engine and pylon had been removed from the wing for inspection and maintenance. So much as in the case of the recent UPS crash. As of now, preliminarily, the NTSB assumes that all the maintenance procedures up until this point have been by the book, so it must simply be metal fatigue that caused the Louisville air crash, right? But before you come at me in the comments, I'm not saying anything in the UPS case was anything other than by the book, routine, proper maintenance. Because I believe that aircraft maintenance professionals at UPS and major airlines for that matter all value human life and aren't cutting corners, so I'm not throwing shade in their direction. I'm just thinking out loud along with you. However, with that said, this was the case with American 191. The NTSB knew the damage most likely occurred during the last engine change, but the investigators had a hard time wrapping their heads around how the damage could have occurred if the maintenance crews were following the manufacturer's design procedures, because the removal procedure recommended by the manufacturer, McDonnell Douglas, required that the engine be detached from the pylon before detaching the pylon itself from the wing. But if that procedure was followed by the book, then that kind of damage would have been impossible, because the NTSB determined that the only way the pylon fitting could strike the wing's mounting bracket in the way that it did was if the bolts that held the pylon to the wing had been removed and the engine and pylon assembly still connected as one unit, not separated as designed. So that left the investigators with only one conclusion, and that was that the damage to the rear pylon mount had been present before the crash occurred rather than being caused by it. And then it came during their exhaustive investigation long after their preliminary investigation that they found their smoking gun. Because in fact, airlines had not been going by the book when it came to the DC-10 engine removal. Because since time is money, the airlines found a much quicker and cheaper way to do engine changes. And it was at that point that the investigation blew wide open. The NTSB found out that American Airlines Flight 191's carrier, as well as Continental Airlines and United Airlines, had all developed a different procedure that saved about 200 man-hours per aircraft, and more importantly, they also thought that from a safety standpoint, it would reduce the number of disconnects of systems such as hydraulic and fuel lines, electrical cables, and wiring from 79 disconnects to just 27. This new procedure involved the removal of the engine and pylon assembly as a singular unit rather than as individual components. But in the case of United Airlines, they at least took a much more prudent approach, as United's implementation involved the use of an overhead crane to support the engine pylon assembly during removal and reinstallation. However, the method chosen by American and Continental Airlines relied on a much more dangerous and crude shortcut by supporting the engine pylon assembly with a large forklift. And finally, the NTSB found its answer, because as they found out, if the forklift had been positioned incorrectly, the engine pylon assembly would not be stable as it was being handled, causing it to rock like a seesaw and jam the pylon against the wing's attachment points. Forklift operators were guided only by hand and voice signals, as they could not directly see the junction between the pylon and the wing. Positioning had to be extremely accurate or structural damage could result, and that's exactly what happened. To make matters worse, work on the doomed DC-10 did not go smoothly, because just as the mechanics started disconnecting the engine and pylon as a single unit, a shift change occurred halfway through the job. During that downtime, however, even though the forklift remained stationary, the forks supporting the entire weight of the engine and pylon moved downward slightly due to normal loss of hydraulic pressure associated with the forklift being turned off. That caused the misalignment between the engine, pylon, and wing. When work was resumed, the pylon was jammed on the wing and the forklift had to be repositioned. Whether damage to the mount was caused by the initial downward movement of the engine pylon structure or by the realignment attempt is still unclear. Regardless of how it happened, the resulting damage, although insufficient to cause an immediate failure, eventually developed into fatigue cracking, worsening with each cycle, takeoff and landing, the 8 weeks that followed. When the attachment finally failed, the engine and its pylon broke away from the wing. The structure surrounding the forward pylon mount also failed from the resulting stresses, and those stresses resulted in the worst single aviation crash in U.S. history. Okay, so in closing, why do I think that in 2025, the NTSB left us what I call a little Easter egg in their preliminary report about a crash that happened 50 years ago, when preliminarily, at least, they think that metal fatigue caused this most recent crash? Well, I think the NTSB has learned over the years, and call me crazy, but I think they're leaving the door open to a possibility that when they follow the breadcrumbs to the end of the trail, if they come to a different conclusion, they're just being open, honest, and transparent with all of us. And that's a good thing. More of that is always better. So that's what I think. How about you? Please be sure and let me know down below.